Well, thank y'all, everyone, for joining us tonight. As Savannah said, we're going to go into small ruminants and talk a little bit more about their pasture management and also some research that is being done on this. Um, as Savannah introduced me earlier, I'm Charlotte Meeks. I'm the extension agent up here in Houston County and also part of the Forage team. So during my presentation, we're going to talk about looking at identifying the different types of forages and some of the basic nutrition content of those forages. And we also want to look at the link between the forage height, and also known as maturity, and our nutrient content. And we'll talk a little bit towards the end about parasite management. So in the next few minutes, we'll dig deep into pasture management to meet the nutritional needs of our small ruminants, focusing mostly on goats, and we'll talk a little bit about sheep as well, and also how we're going to improve our pastures or our forage system based on the forage species we're going to incorporate, enabling the instincts of the animal, especially like for goats who like to browse, and also trying to ensure that we have available forage year-round. And we'll talk just a second on with the internal pesticide or parasite load with those novel forages, and also rational grazing. So as with anything, whether we're dealing with pastures, forages, row crops, pecans, wherever you want to start, we really want to start by looking at our soil. This will give us a lot of the base information we need to know, like what is our water holding capacity or our field capacity, and also looking at our fertility and our soil health based on the nutritional needs of those plants. With most of our forages, we're going to be kind of near a neutral state with our pH between a 6 to a 6.8. And this is the area where you're going to get optimal uptake of the nutrients by the plant. So if you don't test, it's a guess. That's one of the famous sayings that you hear with UGA Extension. Many people know our office as the soil office because that's where all the soil samples come in little brown baggies. You can do this through the extension service. There's also private labs that do this as well. The easiest thing is to get with your extension office on how to correctly pull a soil sample, and we can walk you through the process, get that submitted off to our lab, and get the results back so we know what your fertilization needs are for your pasture or your hay field, and also where your pH is. Another testing that we don't utilize enough is our forage testing. This can be done in pastures, and most of the time we do this in hay fields. I know in my office I have a hay probe that people can check out to pull core samples from their hay, but you can also take samples from your pasture to know what nutrient quality you have available in your forages. So when we talk about forages, we talk about the yield versus the quality of the forage. So when we look at the available forage versus days of growth, as we move through our days of growth, we have more and more available forage until we kind of hit that plateau. Now, when we look at our relative forage quality, it will actually decrease as we move into those longer growth days. So the area we want to hit is where the two of those meet, and that's where we're going to have the ideal forage yield and also have the ideal forage quality. So when we look at our meat goats, so like our Boer goats, our Kikos, most of what I deal with in Houston County, we need to look at what the needs are nutrient-wise for that animal. So when we look at like dry does or bucks, their nutritional needs are going to be much lower versus a growing kid or a lactating doe. When we move into sheep, similar situation. We've got our rams, and our dry ewes are going to be less than if we have lactating animals or also maturing animals as well. With our grazing habits, we know that goats prefer to graze above the shoulder. They like to browse, where for the most part, sheep actually graze and like legumes, and they will also eat forbs as well. So when we're looking at diet selection or our forage selection, we need to think about the grazing habits and what our small ruminants like. As you can see, our goats are more into browsing. That's where they spend most of their time, whereas our sheep are more into our grasses and our legumes. So when we're putting together a forage system, we want to make sure we incorporate enough to meet their nutritional needs, but also to help with their grazing habits as well. So when we look at how these animals like to graze and compare them to our other livestock animals, our cattle and our horses are not as selective. They mostly are going to stay in our grassy area. That's where they're going to spend most of their time grazing. Horses are going to be more selective than their cows with the species of grasses that they're grazing. They also prefer a flat area. As we move into sheep, sheep have a high selective, so they use their mouths and are constantly moving them and are going to be looking for more of those legume species, some grasses, and they will browse a little bit. But when we also look at the surface with a topographical situation, they will move to graze on those steeper areas. And then when we add goats to it, they're going to be very highly selective of what they're grazing, moving more to browsing, and also can put them on those steeper areas of the pasture that our cattle and horses are not going to be at. So when we also look at stocking rates, when we look at, and this is looking at 2 to 2.5 acres, on excellent, we can put in 1 cow versus 5 to 6 sheep or 6 to 8 goats. Now, as we move into the stocking rates, when we've got, a lot of times I'm dealing with a brushy pasture situation with people that are just getting into the business or haven't quite developed their pasture. Putting goats and or sheep are usually a better option because you can allow for a higher population, and also looking at some cleanup as well. And we'll talk about that here in a minute on what goats prefer to graze on. So this is a common picture we see, especially as goats are browsing. This is what we were discussing about them grazing above the shoulder. You see them reaching up, grabbing into the trees, grabbing into the brush, and that's what they're actually foraging on while they're browsing. Kudzu, we see this is becoming more common with using goats to eradicate kudzu. Research has shown that kudzu, if grazed heavily, does not come back, and it actually can provide good nutrient content to those animals, with looking at 50 to 60% total digestible nutrients and 12 to 18% crude protein. The other thing, especially with our goats, they're known to browse a lot of our invasive or weedy types species, things like Chinese privet, pigweed, thistle, stinging nettle, blackberries, plantain, curly dock, multiflora rose, and sweet gum. And all of these are going to be considered weeds in the majority of our pasture situations. So goats can be used to help graze these species down and reduce the pressure of these weeds in our pasture. So here's looking at some before and after pictures. This was a pasture that they were trying to revitalize They put some goats out there in April, and this was the results. As you can see, the goats have came in, they have cleaned out the majority of those weedy and brushy species, but also have grazed up the trees as well. So what's some other things that we know about a goat's diet? They cannot just survive on browsing alone. They do have to have a diverse diet. Browsing alone will not meet their nutritional needs, especially of our young or our lactating animals. We do know that they consume undesirable plants from the pictures that were shown beforehand, and they work great in a co-grazing habitat where you mix them in with horses, cattle, or sheep. Just like many animals, they prefer to consume the new growth, and they also have some resistance to some of our toxic plants that can be toxic to our other livestock. So how are we going to get enough energy into the animal to meet their nutritional needs? Just like us, our small ruminants, they do have a physical limit on how much they can take in. One picture that is shown many times in a lot of our forage talks is a cow who died with a full stomach. And the reason for that was the nutritional content of the forage they were eating was very similar to straw. So there is a physical limit, and we've got to make sure what they're ingesting is going to meet their nutritional needs. We need to look for something that is highly digestible and that's also going to produce high energy. And pretty much the bottom line is we want to make every bite that that animal is taking in count. So in an ideal forage situation, we would have forage year round that would meet their nutritional needs no matter the time of year or the animal that we have out there. But of course, we do not always live in an ideal world, and there's always variables with our forage systems. So most of what I deal with our pasture management systems is going to be our warm season perennial grasses. So this is going to be our Bermuda and our Bahia. We also have our winter annuals that many people plant, and this is going to be your ryegrass or your small grains like your oats. And then we also have cool season perennial grasses. In Houston County, don't have too many cool season perennial grasses. We have things like fescue falls more into a winter annual for us. But if there's anyone joining us from pretty much anywhere north of about Macon, you will deal with some fescue. But as you can see, with a mixture of these, we can kind of try to hit having that forage distribution throughout the year to get a little bit close to meeting our nutritional goals. Here's another breakdown looking at the different species. Pretty much our hybrid Bermuda grass, so most of what our Bermuda grass pastures and hayfields are planted in is going to cover us through the summer months. We also have some of those summer forages that come in, such as pearl millet, that will cover us through the middle of the summer. Our small grains that are cool season small grains such as wheat or rye is going to hit us through those winter months, but will die out through our summer months. So when we get to the forage distribution, we go back and look at what our ideal range was, and that was to have a level forage throughout the year. But what we end up with is the gray area, which is going to be our sustainable stocking rate. And as you can see, based on how our forages run, with most of our forages being most active through the spring and summer months, is when we're going to have most forage available for the animals. But we can halfway get a steady stocking rate and have a steady forage quality for those animals by introducing our annual forages as well as our perennial forages. So at the University of Kentucky, back in '06, they actually did a goat grazing preference trial. And what they found out, the number one thing that goats really like is sorghum Sudan, which is a summer annual that we can grow down here. The other thing was white clover, which is a good winter legume. They also were found to graze on turnips, red clover, chicory, the Lespedeza, which we'll talk about that with possible reduce of parasite load. But as you move down the list, you see Bermuda grass was the last on their desirable list. So incorporating a variety of these grasses and summer annuals and winter annuals, we can meet those goats' nutritional diet. So when we look at cool season perennial grasses, such as tall fescue, like I said, in Houston County and further south, we're not going to deal with fescue very often unless it pops up as more of a winter annual. But this is a great forage in the northern part of Georgia. The biggest thing is having to look for the fescue toxicity. That's one concern among goats, our sheep, and also our livestock. There is some novel endophytes that have some persistence, so you can have the fescue without the toxosis problem. But that's looking at different varieties that you would have to implement. So with warm season perennial grasses, as you saw, this is a field that's got some sorghum Sudan growing on the side with some Bermuda grass. And as earlier, the goat prefers the sorghum Sudan over our warm season perennial grasses such as Bermuda or Bahia. Pearl millet, sorghum Sudan, brown top millet, all of these are good summer annuals that can provide good nutrition quality for our small ruminants. We do have to watch the nitrate toxicity, especially when we go through some drought periods, and especially on pearl millet. Pearl millet is drought resistant, but nitrate toxicity can be a problem, especially if we have drought and you add fertilizer to it around the same time. Sorghum Sudan has a issue, or actually our sorghum varieties in general have an issue with prussic acid after that first frost. So that was one thing you have to mitigate as well. The other thing to look at, you can incorporate these into your pastures as another alternative for summer grazing, and they're preferred more by our small ruminant species. As we saw earlier, legumes, especially for sheep, are a good alternative. There's clovers, red and white clover, and there's also the Lespedeza that falls in that as well. The good thing about our legumes, not only do they provide great quality, they also fixate nitrogen into our soil, and alfalfa would also fall into the legume family as well. So when we look at the difference in forage quality among the species we talk about with our warm season perennial grasses and our annual grasses, so when we look at the maintenance levels, so these are your dry animals or your bucks, they need just the lower quality forage when we look at the digestible matter. Now, as we move into our modern production, these are going to be your growing animals, and then high production, especially looking at those lactating animals, really want to move more towards those legumes, the cool season annual grasses, and we can even get to some high digestible quality even with our perennial grasses and our summer annuals. So some research that's been done has found that incorporating legumes into a tall fescue situation can offset the endophyte toxicity with tall fescue. So one of our issues with parasites with goats, we all know, especially with small ruminants, with goats, we have some resistance to our dewormers. And often this is caused by we force the animal to closely graze to the ground to where they're taking up those parasites. So one thing we can do is a rational grazing or rotational grazing where we leave the grass height taller and allow it to be a little bit more mature. And this can be done through those rotational grazing, leaving it to about 4 to 6 inches. Another thing that's being looked at much by Fort Valley with Dr. Nikki is the Sericea lespedeza. This is something that's been shown to reduce the fecal egg count of the parasites. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next part about the tannins as being the research that's being done to actually reduce the fecal egg count. So with our rotational or rational grazing, pretty much you're going to reduce the parasite pressure by allowing that grass to grow back to where the animals are not grazing right on the ground. This is also going to allow the animal to select higher quality forage as that grass or those other forages come back. This also reduces the pressure on the pasture to where that root system can grow deeper and allow for better tolerance when we go through a drought season. This can be integrated in any pasture. The biggest thing to look for is your fencing and where your water sources and your shades are located at. With perimeter fencing, there's, the tale of if a fence won't hold water, it's not going to hold a goat. And that's one thing we need to look at with putting up fencing for our pasture. We can't do what we do with cattle and just throw a hot wire, just one string of hot wire to keep them in. Goat fencing has to be very strong with very small openings and actually using hot wire as well. You can see in this illustration where this has got multiple strands of hot wire along the fence, and this is wire that's actually going to stay hot all the time. So that was just a very quick overview. We're going to dig a little bit deeper with our next presentation. You can always find more information at our georgiaforages.com. Some other information as well. And I'll take some time for any questions.
Hey, this is Mary Walker. We recently adopted 2 baby goats and we are looking to erect a fence. Are there resources for novice goat owners like ourselves out there so we kind of know what the cost might be?
Yeah, so Mary, I can work with you some more on that. And I can send you some of these links on actually developing the fence. I know we had talked about that you had gotten some quotes on the cost of the fence. I think the best thing is I'll give you a call back tomorrow and we'll look up setting up a site visit.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And I can send, I'm going to send this presentation and we can send it out to everybody.
Are there any more questions? I don't have any on my end, Charlotte, so I guess we'll roll with the next speaker. Dr. Cervantes,
could you please help me share?
Yeah. Don't I have to make him a co-host, Charlotte? Yes.
I can't share my screen. Okay.
Yeah. I made you a co-host, so you should be able to now.
All right. It should be okay. You can see it now, right? Okay. I assume. Okay. You can all see it now, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Andres Cervantes. I'm currently serving as an assistant professor at the Department of Animal Science at Fort Valley State University. And in today's presentation, I will extend a little bit of the talk about plant secondary metabolites. Particularly, we are talking about tannins and strategies to use these tannins in favor of small ruminants. So before jumping into this discussion, we need to describe in general what's the difference between grazers and browsers. The previous presentation briefly mentioned that, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper in that description because it has important implications that will help us decide which scenario is the best for our animals. So sheep are grazers, just like cattle, and that means they have higher fiber digestibility. That's an important difference. The second is that they consume much more feed, so the intake is higher. The retention time in the feed throughout the GI tract is higher as well. And therefore, because of these three aspects, the body weight is higher compared to browsers, okay? In general, as a general rule, sheep or grazers in general are less selective. Whereas goats, as browsers, they tend to have lower fiber digestibility because of the fact that they are browsers, okay? So they are a lot more picky, and that means they have a selective intake. Therefore, their retention time is also lower. And this is simply because the amount of feed they consume passes throughout the GI tract faster, okay? So these differences lead goats as animals that gain lower weight compared to sheep and cattle, but in exchange, they have some degree of tolerance to tannins. We are going to discuss some details about tannins in general, but this is an important distinction I want to make because in the following slides, I will be talking about the inner relationship between tannins and small ruminants that it's related to all these concepts. Okay, so previously they were discussed some of the requirements between sheep and goats, but the main point of this slide is differentiating between small ruminants and cattle. So if we see here, there is a big difference between energy requirements among sheep and cattle. So this is important. It's important to denote this because in most of the cases, some producers, particularly those ones that are used to work with cattle, and they try to work with small ruminants, they try to implement the same nutritional strategies or the same management. And the truth is that although they are ruminants like cattle, they have different requirements. And this means they are slightly different. So we need to tweak a little things before jumping into these animals. Now, when we look at the comparison between goats and cattle, we can see that it's much more evident. And this is related to the fact that the grazing style is different, right? So we are going to show you some strategies that could maximize the use of both species. It's called mixed grazing. So I'm going to talk about mixed grazing and how you could take advantage of your cattle and use goats in synergy with both your cattle and goats and improve your performance in this case. Okay, so it was also discussed that we have a wide variety of forages used for sheep and goat production. But in general, here in Georgia, and particularly in this area, in the Southeast in general, we rely heavily on warm season grasses. We have some cool season grasses, but for the most part, we rely on warm season grasses as the main source of fiber for ruminants. In second place, we have the use of warm season legumes. And as we said, we are going to talk about this because this is the kind of the central point of today's talk. And finally, we're going to talk about a little bit about cool season legumes, particularly alfalfa in this case, that is gaining some importance in small ruminant production recently as well. So I think this was also discussed. We are going to briefly mention that depend upon the season and depend upon the targeted forage, we will have differences in availability. And we know that this is just a prediction. Sometimes we have changes due to global warming or unexpected aspects that will change the distribution of our forage throughout the year. But in general, this is how forages behave throughout the year. It's important to denote that Sericea lespedeza is commonly present most of the year, along with our warm season grasses. The problem here is that we have to be careful when we should use these forages and when we should use certain strategies. And I will discuss some of those strategies throughout this presentation. Okay, so jumping into the central point of today's discussion, Sericea lespedeza has been used for more than 20 years as an alternative for small ruminant production systems. And this is because it's a low input legume, so which means it's relatively easy to grow. It's a tannin-rich forage, but it's a nutraceutical forage. And this term nutraceutical means that it's a forage that has the ability to provide some medical benefits. It's commercially available. So if we remember, we have, the biggest company that sells Sericea lespedeza is Sims Brothers. They have a pelletized version, and they sell all kind of hay, and they have different types of lespedeza depending upon their needs. But in general, this is a forage that is widely used for small ruminant production, and we have good reasons to use it, but we need to understand why we should use it with caution, okay? So this is another important point I want to make. We face unique challenges in small ruminant production systems, and this is true throughout the world, but particularly in the Southeast. Why? Well, because we have a lot of technical constraints. Perhaps the most important one is the presence of parasites, followed by heat stress, then the high MDF content or fiber content in our forages due to the fact that those are warm season grasses, so they have relatively lower quality compared to cool season grasses. And these three constraints together lead to a fourth constraint, which is poor gain. Okay, so we have to deal with the fact that we have low quality forages along with parasites, because this is an important aspect. Compared to cool season grasses or colder areas, parasites are present in higher numbers in the soil in warm areas. So we have an antagonistic relationship between low quality forages and high numbers of parasites. And this gives the opportunity to have very difficult situations and disastrous problems with small ruminants. Okay, so we discussed we have this antagonistic effect, parasites and condensed tannins. And these condensed tannins are plant secondary metabolites. And just tannins by themselves, they have the ability to affect rumen metabolism. And that translates in nothing more than reducing fermentation and bacterial synthesis, which is important to ensure animal performance. But along with that, we have the problem of parasites that affect average daily gain and health status. So these two separate aspects combine together and create some sort of a unique problem that translates in poor gain, in poor quality, and poor animal performance. So what we have done over the past 10 years in Fort Valley State University, very recently, we have also established that is how can we come up with a strategy to take advantage of these tannins to reduce parasites, but also ensure animal performance? Well, this inner relationship is so important that it's easier to show this with a picture, okay? In this picture, you can see we have two carcasses. The two carcasses, believe it or not, have exactly the same age, exactly the same breed. They are technically brothers, okay? But the problem here is that one animal is extremely susceptible to parasites and the other one is not, okay? So this is an important constraint that adds up to the already difficult problems we are facing. So parasites and low quality forages and low management are the perfect recipe for disaster, okay? So we cannot remove one from another. We need to work with all of them together because this is a serious problem, and this is probably the reason why most of the people give up on trying small ruminant production, okay? So, but what we could say about tannins, tannins are not like black and white. We cannot say it's entirely bad or it's entirely good. Tannins are just plant secondary metabolites that have some features that could cause certain positive effects or negative effects. The extent or which effects we are going to observe depend upon our ability to work with them. Okay, some of the positive aspects of tannins is that most of the research has been done to use tannins to decrease methane emissions. They are very good decreasing methane emissions, so they have some positive use. Another positive use they could possibly have is the fact that they bind proteins. This binding process allows nitrogen retention to be higher in animals, and nitrogen retention means that the animal will retain more protein and eventually will lead to higher body weight gain. Along with these features, tannins have also the unique ability to control parasites. Some of these compounds, particularly condensed tannins, have the ability to act as antiparasitic or antimicrobial compounds. Just to give you an example, we know that Sericea lespedeza has a specific type of tannin called prodolphinidins. Those prodolphinidins have a unique antiparasitic effect that kills the worms. And this has huge implications for small ruminant production systems, simply because we rely heavily on drugs to control parasites. And this is causing a growing problem related to parasite resistance. So we need to develop strategies to implement these tannin-rich plants in a way that do not compromise animal production, but they also help to reduce these parasite problems. So in this series of graphs, research have demonstrated that condensed tannins could help to reduce nitrogen losses and increase body weight gain in small ruminants. So this proves that tannins in some way could be beneficial. Now, we are dealing with compounds that if we make a small mistake, those effects will dilute and we will very likely have negative effects. And this is the challenge that we are facing and we have been facing over the past 20 years with tannins. Sometimes the effects are positive and sometimes the effects are negative because we want to have plants that have these antiparasitic effects, but we don't want to have very active compounds that might compromise animal performance. So it's clear that Sericea lespedeza has the ability to decrease fecal egg counts. And this has been demonstrated a number of times in different research experiments. And we have come up with a comprehensive idea that Sericea lespedeza could be an alternative to control parasites and improve animal performance in the Southeast. More recently, we have come up with meta-analytic evaluation, and we have taken all the information we have done with Lespedeza to come up with a single answer to how we should, what is the exact inclusion rate we should have of Lespedeza in our diet to ensure these positive effects. And very recently, we conclude that when we use Lespedeza-based diets, we shouldn't exceed more than 60% of inclusion rate in the diet to not compromise animal performance. So this means that if you are going to use Lespedeza as your main forage, you might consider to use Lespedeza up to 60% in the diet. This red line indicates that if you go beyond 60%, you are decreasing dry matter digestibility. And dry matter digestibility is a proxy for average daily gain, okay? So we have to work under the optimum conditions to ensure that our animals will gain weight and they will have the benefits of the antimicrobial and antiparasitic effects of Lespedeza. We have also observed that condensed tannins in Lespedeza have also that anti-methanogenic effect, which is very positive considering that most of the carbon footprint produced by grazing systems is a lot higher compared to intense systems. So we need to play in both sides. We need to ensure higher animal performance, but we also need to be sustainable. And we have the ability to accomplish both, but it requires a little bit of effort. So we are moving forward and doing efforts to ensure that. So here we have some examples of comparative diets in which we use Lespedeza hay against alfalfa hay. And we can see that from the chemical composition standpoint, they are very similar. So this indicates that Lespedeza could be used as an alternative, and it could be used in some degree to control parasites, to use sustainable diets, but also to reduce the cost of the overall animal operation, which is also important in this area in which feedstuffs are a little bit expensive compared to other areas. Another strategy I want to point out is the use of mixed grazing. This mixed grazing, if you remember in the very first slide, I point out the differences between browsers and grazers. And this is probably one of the most important strategies that some of you might consider to use, especially if you have cattle. So it has been demonstrated that if you use infected goats along with cattle in the same area, you technically increase herbage production. Why? Well, because cattle is a grazer and goats are browsers. So they complement each other, and this helps to control weeds a lot better than just having a single species. This also translates in higher average daily gain in small ruminants, which is also very positive. So this implies that you could take advantage not only using these plant secondary metabolites, but also using strategies, synergistic strategies. In this case, using mixed grazing is probably an alternative that you could try to use. If you require more technical information, particularly for those of you who are into the cattle business, I can just give you more specific information about how you handle stocking rate in cattle compared to goats and combine them together, etc. So along with those strategies, we also have other alternatives. I'm not going to discuss this alternative in greater extent because this is part of Lisa and Dr. Tucker's research, but we know that this combination of alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures represent an excellent forage that could be also an alternative for small ruminants as well. Along with that, part of our research has explored the use of alternative breeds as to ensure a sustainable animal production system. In this case, we have worked with what is called Florida native sheep, or called Florida crack sheep. This type of sheep has one particular feature that stands out compared to the others, and that's the fact that it's adapted to the Southeast. And adapted means that it's parasite resistant, and this is very, very important. For those of you who are into the small ruminant business, you understand that the resistant species could represent as an important saving in terms of money. So these are some of the alternatives you could explore in case you are interested in providing somehow differences in your production systems. Now, as a general rule, we need to discuss some of the general strategies we believe we should implement in small ruminant production systems. And this is purely based on our research. First of all, is that we should, in some degree, try to reduce the grazing time during the summer. And this is very, very important, because it has been demonstrated that during the summer, the larvae on the soil could increase up to 40%. And the more larvae you have, the higher the parasitic burden, which means that susceptible animals will die in a matter of days. We have seen that. We understand that sometimes it's not possible to do it, but that's why we develop certain strategies. One of those could be using hay, reducing the grazing time and using hay or haylage, or perhaps ensuring using high quality forages that were previously wrapped in bales, I don't know, during spring, in which we don't have that much parasites. And maybe we could use those during the summer to reduce the chances of having highly parasitic animals. Another important aspect is checking the FAMACHA score. This is something crucial because we always try to check on the status of the animals. And we are not trying to deworm all of the animals at the same time. In most of the cases, we have animals, just like in the picture I showed you before, we have animals that are extremely susceptible, but that doesn't mean that if one animal presents those symptoms, or the whole herd needs to be dewormed. So those are certain strategies that add up. Another point that is important to mention is that supplementation is required, and this has been also demonstrated by research. We need to account for the parasitic burden in terms of crude protein, and this is because the parasite causes anemia and therefore reduces the immune cells in the animals and eventually lead to death. Okay, so these are some of the main points I would like to discuss. And in general, if you have something else you want to discuss, feel free to reach me. Just as a general take-home message, small ruminant production systems have unique challenges in the Southeast, and this is important because of the reasons I previously discussed. For those of you who are wondering why are we talking so much about Sericea lespedeza, well, it's simply because we need to use alternatives to control parasites, and the anti-helminthic resistance we are observing, not only here, but throughout the world, is very, very worrisome. It's very hard. And we have more and more reports of resistance everywhere. And this compromises small ruminant production systems. And eventually, what we are trying to do is we are trying to reduce the chances of having resistance in all of our herds. Okay. Another important aspect I would like to mention is the fact that mixed grazing strategies could be an alternative that might help to increase animal performance. And this is particularly important for those of you who are cattle persons and wish to have some small ruminants. So there are ways in which you can improve your systems using this strategy. So here's my contact information. Feel free to reach me if you have any additional questions. And thank you so much for your time.
Are there any questions about anything?
Yes, this is Kayla. Can y'all hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, I had a question about the Sericea Lespedeza. You said that they offer it in pellets. Did you
Yeah.
say that it was the Sims Brothers was the?
Yes, Sims Brothers. Yes, Sims Brothers is a company that is in Alabama. So they sell Lespedeza in pellets, but also
Okay.
in form of hay. Okay.
Okay.
If you Google Sims Brother Alabama, you will find it. You just put Sericea
Okay.
Lespedeza Sims Brother, and they
Okay.
have a website. They have a Facebook page. You can contact them, and they have all very. I think they sell Lespedeza not only in the Southeast, but they also export Lespedeza to other places like Kentucky and Ohio. I have seen a lot of customers everywhere.
Okay, thank you so much. It
All
was
right.
helpful.
Any more? All right. Well, if you look in the chat box, I have put in a link for a survey for our forage team. So this helps us get funding and grants and a lot of other cool stuff to be able to give you guys, whether it's in presentation form, Zoom form, in person, just to give us some information about our clients and things like that. It's really important for us, even just for, just getting the ability to go out and do certain presentations in person, things like that at this point. So please fill that out for us. You can contact any of us on the forage team by going to the Georgia Forages website and getting our contact information. Any of us will be glad to help you. However we can. You can also talk with your local county extension agent and get their information and speak with them as well. Anything else? If you happen to want to go back and review the presentation, it will be on uploaded to our Georgia Forages YouTube channel at some point. So you'll be able to find it there. So there is a question for a feed and forage analysis. How important is it to denote species? Does it change based on the animals denoted? Ms. Connie, so the results are going to be the same. The recommendations will be different. So if you're familiar with how to feed or supplement based on your report, the species is not super important. Otherwise, the species is very important. They also use that information for different reports for state legislators and just general information about the species. Our farm gate values come from some of that, are factored, not comes from it, but are factored into that. So it's important on our end, not necessarily on your end.
Can I add something to your comment?
Sure, absolutely.
Yes, regarding to the question, yes, the analysis is the same, but the recommendation, as you said, is different. And it's important to mention that just like we have the NRC for cattle and dairy, we have the NRC for small ruminants. So what we do as technicians is, if we have a question like this, the first point that we are going to discuss is, tell me the features of your animals, how old your animals are. And depending upon that, we are going to decide and design a diet or a strategy that might fit your needs. So just like any other ruminant, we have NRC that covers for dairy small ruminants and meat small ruminants.